says, maybe it will read it. I'm now the retired curator at Henry Ford Museum. I really want to thank the museum for inviting me. They invited me last year, but we all know what happened this year. So I've been able to make it this year. And I will, as we proceed here, you will note that there's a couple of technical glitches. Apparently when you prepare a document on a Macintosh and try to run it on a Windows machine, they don't always mesh. So we'll get past it. We'll make it work. As you can see, the time of the talk, 300 Years with Henry Ford. I will explain that slightly odd title.
Because you're not that old.
I'm not that old. One of Henry Ford's most important, if underappreciated talents was his ability to recognize the talent in other people and attract them to his ventures. So today I'm going to talk about some of those talented people who made the whole Ford empire go. In order to keep the talk to a reasonable length, I've narrowed it down to 9 people who worked for Ford for a minimum of 25 years each. And that gave me the title of the talk because when I added up all of their years of service, it totaled 300 years. So there it goes. Some of the people I'll talk about you've probably heard of, and others you may never heard of, but they were all key players in Ford's operation. Some of the really familiar names are missing because they didn't meet my 25-year criteria. Clarence Avery, who was a key figure in developing the assembly line, he only worked for Ford for 15 years. James Couzens, who was absolutely essential in the early years as the business manager of the operation, he left after 12 years. And Harold Wills, who started with Henry Ford in 1899 at the Detroit Automobile Company, and was key, of course, in designing the Model T. Well, he left after 20 years. So, but some of the other people you will have heard of, and let's start with one that I think everybody knows about, Charles Sorensen. Charles Lindbergh described Sorensen as being born of another era. He lived in the two-gun days of American industry, and he shot it out with the best of them. He was hard-boiled. He was a hard-boiled, hard-fisted fighter, and probably would prefer to be known as such. And I think anybody who knew him would agree with that. Sorensen was born in Denmark. He came to the U.S. with his parents when he was 4 years old. He was trained as a pattern maker, making wooden patterns to help create molds for casting metal. He advanced very quickly, very bright, very ambitious guy. At the age of 18, he became the foreman of a pattern shop at the Linderman Hoverson Stove Works in Milwaukee. And I love this picture. That's Sorensen. He's 18 years old. He looks like he's 25. And even at 18, he exhibits what the Army likes to call the command presence. You can tell he's the boss. Age 24, he joined Ford Motor Company. That was in 1905, and he was just a regular pattern maker. But again, he advanced very rapidly. By 1907, he was the head of the pattern shop. And Sorensen very quickly realized that Henry Ford did not like to read drawings and blueprints. He liked to see things in 3 dimensions. So Sorensen used his woodworking skills as a pattern maker to make models of things, of new designs of things that Ford was working on. Or sometimes he could make a quick pattern and make a quick casting that would get you closer to the part. It was sort of rapid prototyping circa 1907. And this skill served him very well during the development of the Model T in 1907, 1908. Sorensen was one of those guys who was in the room when they were designing the Model T. And he was the guy who was responsible for the one-piece casting of the Model T block, which was a really modern feature in 1908 when the Model T came out. Most cars didn't have a one-piece block. The Model M had a 3-piece block, crankcase, and two groups of cylinders. Sorensen's power grew very steadily until he was effectively the assistant superintendent of production at the Cat Avenue plant. Now, Ford didn't like titles, so you never saw an organization chart that said superintendent, assistant superintendent. But effectively, he was the second in command in charge of production at Cat Avenue and making the new Model T. When they moved to the Highland Park plant in 1910, Sorensen kept that position. And he was part of the group that developed the moving assembly line at the Highland Park plant. During World War I, he was given charge of making Fordson tractor production of Fordson tractors. And when that tractor production moved to the Rouge factory after the war, Sorensen saw his change. And he was able to basically take control of the whole Rouge, everything they were doing. And so as production of Model T parts moved from Highland Park to the Rouge, Sorensen kept taking charge of everything. And the guy who had been his boss at Highland Park, Peter Martin, was losing out to Sorensen. And finally, when they began production of the Model A and shifted everything to the Rouge, Martin came over from Highland Park. He came over as Sorensen's second in command. And in fact, Sorensen also saw the chance to eliminate other rivals because he purged a lot of the old Model T guys. In fact, as he says, I want to get rid of all the Model T SOBs and all the Model T methods of doing things. Now, of course, the biggest Model T SOB of them all was Charlie Sorensen, but he didn't see that. So he essentially ran the Rouge with Peter Martin as a subordinate. But he kept his hands in foundry production, and when they went to move to the Model to the V8 to replace the Model A, and Henry Ford said, I want a Model T block cast in one piece because it's lighter and cheaper. That was another challenge, and that was a whole lot harder than the Model T block, the four-cylinder block. The V8 block, casting a one-piece V8 block was really difficult, and that was one of Sorensen's triumphs. And this is the way most people made a V8, and of course, we're all familiar with the flathead V8 block. So, with great difficulty, they met the challenge led by Sorensen. Sorensen was unquestionably an organizational genius, but he achieved much of his success by driving his employees mercilessly, and Sorensen motivated by fear. His temper was legendary, but clearly Henry Ford approved of his methods, because if he didn't, Sorensen would have gone. Now, as important as Sorensen was to the Ford organization, he remained largely unknown outside of the automobile industry. But that all changed during World War II, when Sorensen was given charge of the Willow Run bomber plant, designing and building the new plant to make B-24 bombers. There we go. Bombers off to infinity. And there's actually two assembly lines. You can see this assembly line, but they're also, it bends, and they go off in that direction for final finishing. This plant was a wonder when it was built. It was the source of controversy when it turned out that making bombers on assembly lines was a lot more difficult than anybody thought. And then it became a wonder again when they ironed out the difficulties, and they were turning out a bomber a day. The newspapers latched onto this, and they hailed Sorensen as production wizard. Unfortunately, Henry Ford did not like other people getting publicity when his name was on the building, and he began to push Sorensen aside. And after Edsel Ford died in 1943, it was clear that Sorensen's days were numbered, and he finally resigned in March of 1944. very quickly became president of Willys Overland, and he didn't retire from there until 1953, and he died in 1968. And if any of you, if you really want to read an interesting book about the whole early days of Ford, read Sorensen's My 40 Years with Ford. It's don't trust everything he says, because human memory is a tricky thing, but it's an interesting book. The next guy up is somebody I already mentioned, Peter Martin. Martin was similar to Sorensen in some ways. Great organizational skills, he was loyal to a fault, and he drove his employees with fear and intimidation. He was a Canadian. He was born in Wallsburg, Ontario, and he came to Detroit with his family when he was 10 years old. Harold Wills actually hired him for Ford Motor Company in late 1903. Martin was barely 21 years old, and the company was barely 6 months old. And while Martin only had a sixth grade education, he was very smart, he worked very hard, and he rose very quickly. This is a picture from 1904. That's Martin. This is a very early Ford race car. And at that point, Martin is just a mechanic, but he rose quickly. By the end of 1906, he was in charge of all the manufacturing at the Piquette Avenue plant with Sorensen as his assistant. In 1908, Martin oversaw the launching of Model T production at the Piquette plant. And when they moved to Highland Park, Martin was again in charge of all the production, and there, along with Clarence Avery and Sorensen and Harold Wills and a bunch of other people, they developed that famous innovation we call the assembly line. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when Sorensen took charge of Ford's tractor production at the Rouge, he took his opportunity to consolidate his power. And during the 20s, his Model T production, Model T parts production shifted to the Rouge. Martin and Sorensen butted heads, and Martin even offered to resign. Henry Ford didn't accept his resignation, and Martin lacked that just overpowering ambition that Sorensen had. And finally, Martin settled into this subordinate position, and he and Sorensen were able to work reasonably well together. He was just as hard-boiled as Sorensen, but he didn't have that explosive, capricious temper that he could just go off. He didn't go off like a bomb like Sorensen did. But working for Martin could be a strain, whether you were a foreman or whether you were installing wheels on the assembly line. But apparently being Martin could also be a strain. He felt the need to get away from work by spending weekends on his boat. And they were on the Great Lakes. And Henry Ford wanted Martin to put a radio telephone on the boat so Ford could get in touch with him. And Martin refused. When he was away, he was going to be away. Despite all that, he suffered a heart attack in the late 1930s and resigned for health reasons in 1941. He died 3 years later. He was only 62. And this is a pattern that's going to repeat as we talk about some other people. The next guy up is Joe Galan. By the time Joe Galan arrived in the U.S., when he was 22 years old, came here in 1903, he'd already served as a naval engineer in his native Hungary. He'd worked for several German firms. In the U.S., he built his resume as a tool maker for Westinghouse. He built carburetors for the Stearns Automobile Company. He worked as a tool designer for another company. So when he was hired by Harold Wills in 1905, he was a guy with a lot of experience. And he also he was a draftsman, and he had a very expressive drafting style, which attracted Henry Ford's eye. even though Ford didn't like to look at drawings, he minded Joe Galam's drawings less. That's Galam and his drafting table. And Galam's work on the Model N Ford led Henry to include him as part of that group that gathered at the back of Baguette Avenue on the 3rd floor to design the new, what would become the Model T. And of course, we're all familiar, this is at Baguette. Those doors are still there. And this is the prototype Model T after they got it built and they took it on its long shakedown cruise, and it's come back to covered with mud. But in the room when they were designing the Model T, what they would do is they would get a design of some new part that they were going to work on. They'd draw it on blackboard, and they would discuss it. They'd be able to change it. Sorensen might make a wooden model of it so Henry could see it in 3 dimensions. When they got the design finalized, they'd take a photograph, and then Galam would use that photograph to make a measured drawing, so that then they can machine the part. It's a very interesting process, and as we'll see when I talk about someone else, it was an idea that Ford actually continued to use for several years. That method. Once the T went into production, Galam became in charge of body engineering, and he was also responsible for replacing a lot of Model T's forged parts with lighter and cheaper make stamped steel parts. Henry Ford was kind of ambiguous about that. He really liked Ford parts. He liked forged parts, but he also liked inexpensive parts. But he would make fun of Joe Galam's Hungarian accent. He would call these steel stampings, he referred to them as Hungarian stimpings. During World War I, Galam worked on a tank that actually didn't get into production until after the war was over. And he helped develop the engine that was used on the Ford's tractor. And he did some work on the X engine, that obsession of Henry Ford's that was a failed attempt to be an engine that would replace, in a new car that would replace the Model T. And Galam continued to function as the chief body engineer through the 1930s. That is not a Joe Galam drawing, it's just a dimension drawing of a Model A body. But Galam was responsible for body engineering. He oversaw the changeover to all steel bodies at the end of the Model T's run. And like other Ford people, he had a heart attack in 1943 at age 62, and he retired the next year. And retirement seems to have been good for his health because he lived until 1955, passing away at age 74. But unlike some other Ford executives, Galam survived by keeping his head down, and he avoided all the power struggles in the plant. He said, I was very quiet, and I went ahead and did my own job without bothering anybody, which also meant he was not a threat to other guys. And so he was able to survive in what was often a very difficult environment. Eugene Farkas is another Hungarian immigrant. He's one of those very rare early Ford subordinates who had a college education. His degree came from the Royal Joseph Technical Institute in Hungary. And he came to the U.S. in 1906. He was 25 years old, and as he said, he spoke about 17 words of English. And he worked for a variety of American companies, including a couple of stints at Ford before his friend Joe Galam induced him to come back to Ford in 1913. And there he worked on various experimental things. He worked on an electric car, but which obviously never came to fruition. His opportunity came when Sorensen tapped him to oversee the design of the Fordson tractor. And here's our technical glitch. Apparently, when you do a PowerPoint on a Macintosh and then try to show it on a Windows machine, things don't translate perfectly. So we all know that's a Fordson tractor. In the 20s, Farkas spent considerable time on this so-called X engine. This was Henry Ford's idea to make it was essentially a radial engine, cylinders at 90 degrees. It was an 8-cylinder engine. They made a water-cooled version, an air-cooled version. It never worked well. But Henry was obsessed by it. Eventually, they gave up and moved to the V8. But Farkas also worked on the Model A clutch, its transmission, suspension, brakes, much more successful there. And I love this photo. This is Farkas's office. You can see, got blackboards here with drawing stuff on them. Got some manifolds there. You can see manifolds on the floor. In fact, you can see parts all over the floor. Designed at Ford Motor Company at this point, and this is 1923. It was clearly a very hands-on operation. They were sketching these things out. They were making the prototypes, and they were dealing with them and modifying them as things went on. He also worked on the small V8, the so-called V860, the 60 horsepower V8. And during World War II, he worked on B-24 components. And he retired in 1947, did not have a heart attack, wasted no time moving to California, to Laguna Beach, because he loved to fish. And apparently he was a surf fisherman and had a happy 16 years of retirement. Died in 1963. I would bet that hardly anybody, has anybody here heard of Albert Weibel? I'm not surprised. He's one of the lesser known names, but he was in charge of one of those classic behind the scenes functions, purchasing. Ford Motor Company's ability to turn out engines and transmissions and body standards and all is legendary. But when you begin to think about, that's the output side, when you begin to think about the input side, it's just as impressive, because you have to purchase all those raw materials for making cars: iron, limestone, coal, sand for making glass, rubber for making tires. And unfortunately, my wonderful picture of the Rouge stock bins fell victim to our glitch. Trust me. All that stuff is back there behind the ships, which of course, he also had to purchase ships. And he purchased office equipment and lubricating oil, paint, paper, grease, cardboard for boxes, you name it. Weibel oversaw the purchasing of it. Everything had to arrive on time, had to be lowest price, consistent with quality, and Weibel was the man who oversaw this. Now oddly enough, he was another college boy, but he got his college degree the hard way. He worked his way through Indiana University by going to school in the summer and teaching during the winter. So it took him a while. But in 1912, he took his degree and a love of mathematics to Detroit, where he interviewed with Ford Motor Company. And Oscar Bornholz, who was in charge of the engineering procurement, was impressed by him, and he told Weibel, well, college education ought to be worth something. So he hired him. And Weibel started his career buying machine tools for Highland Park. And eventually he became the assistant to Fred Deal, who was the overall guy in charge of purchasing. When Deal left the company in 1927, Weibel succeeded him. And he was in charge of the Rouge, Highland Park, of all the domestic branch plants, and all the overseas operations. Purchasing for all of them, he had 500 people doing this. When they made the change at the Rouge, from making Model T parts to making Model A parts and whole Model A's, they had something like 45,000 machines. And between 1927 and 1928, half of them were rebuilt for the new car. And the other half were scrapped and replaced. And Weibel oversaw all of it. During World War II, he earned a great reputation with the U.S. government because he was overseeing the purchasing necessary for making Jeeps, making tanks, aircraft engines, and of course, B-24s. However, all that was very little use when he crossed a guy whose name you probably do know, Harry Bennett. And Harry Bennett decided to undermine Weibel because Weibel was scrupulously honest, which is what you want in a purchasing guy. Not to put too fine a point on it, Bennett was not scrupulously honest. And he had favored suppliers he wanted Weibel to buy from, and Weibel wouldn't do it. And so Bennett got Henry Ford to fire him. Weibel was well known in the industry. He found another position very quickly with Nash Kelvinator, which later merged with Hudson, became American Motors. And Weibel stayed with AMC until 1956. When he retired and died in 1965 at age 79. So he had probably leaving Ford Motor Company was good for his health. Ford Motor Company made Henry Ford very wealthy, and that wealth gave him the freedom to do lots of other things. One of those things was build Greenfield Village. And the key figure in building Greenfield Village was Edward Cutler. He was the guy who oversaw the purchase of buildings and their movement to Greenfield Village. And there is nothing in Cutler's background that would lead you to believe that he would be the guy to do that. He was educated at the Cincinnati Art Academy and worked for several years designing and repairing stained glass windows. And his first job at Ford was cutting glass for windshields. Started there in 1950, which would be a come down from working on stained glass windows. Eventually he transferred to the drafting department, and there he attracted Henry Ford's attention because Cutler was assigned to design a windmill as part of the restoration of Ford's boyhood home. Now, that farmstead was at the corner of Greenfield and Ford Roads in Dearborn. It was not at Greenfield Village as it is now because Greenfield Village hadn't been built yet. So this was the original site of the farm where Henry Ford grew up. Sorensen designed a windmill because there had been a windmill there, and Ford liked his work. Cutler, much like Joe DeLong, Cutler could make quick sketches of buildings that Henry Ford could understand. And so Ford grabbed him and promoted him, and in the early 20s, Cutler oversaw the restoration of the Wayside Inn in Massachusetts, which Henry Ford bought, the Botsford Tavern, which is north of Detroit, another property that Ford bought. And as Henry toured his properties in Dearborn looking for a place for what would be Greenfield Village, Cutler was with him, assessing the layout. And then, once they settled on the site, Cutler took on the task of moving villages to Greenfield Village. And they didn't move these buildings whole. When they would identify a structure, Henry would buy it. Cutler would make drawings, measure drawings. They disassemble the building, number all the pieces, And then like a giant Tinker Toy set, when they got it back to Greenfield Village, they put it all back together. Now, some of these buildings posed a real challenge. This is what is now called the Eagle Tavern, then they called it the Clinton Inn. It was originally built in 1831. That's the way it looked in 1925, before Ford bought it. And that's the way it looked in 1929 when Greenfield Village opened. So they had to just take that thing apart, move it, and then restore it. Cutler didn't limit himself to relocating old buildings. He also designed and built new ones that were supposed to look old. Like the town hall, and this was Martha Mary Chapel at Greenfield Village. In his spare time, he designed interiors for Ford Trimotor aircraft. He did illustrations for Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent newspaper, and he remodeled Clara Ford's beach house on Lake Huron. So he was a busy guy. And unlike some of the other people who met either an untimely end or an untimely end to their career, Cutler didn't get fired, he didn't survive, he didn't leave because of health problems. After Henry Ford suffered a major stroke in 1945, Cutler transferred to Rouge as an architectural engineer, and after Ford died in 1947, Cutler retired. Because the motor company was not going to be adding any more buildings to Greenfield Village. They were too busy focusing on the company surviving. Cutler had a happy retirement. He spent a lot of his time painting pictures, and he died in 1961 at age 78. Now, some of the names I've talked about, you've heard about, some you haven't. I would be shocked if anybody in this room or anybody at this event was familiar with Russell Hudson McCarroll. But McCarroll was a key guy. Automobiles are made of steel and iron alloys. And the guy who saw that Ford used the right alloys was Hud McCarroll. He was a schoolmate of Edson's, Henry's son, in grade school and high school, but unlike Edsel, McCarroll went to college. Graduated from the University of Michigan with a chemical engineering degree in 1914. And somewhat surprisingly, Henry Ford, who wasn't all that fond of college guys, actually encouraged, recruited McCarroll to work at Ford Motor Company. And there he worked on a variety of chemical problems with paints and oils and things. But when the Rouge steel mill went online, McCarroll worked on the processes at the steel mill. He especially focused on the making and heat treating of iron and steel. He took charge and developed chemical laboratories that analyzed all the metals and the parts. There's McCarroll's chemical labs at the Rouge. He also took the lead in replacing the Ford V8's forged crank with a cast steel crankshaft. Had to find steel with suitable chemistry, develop the casting techniques, develop the heat treating techniques. All that trouble ended up saving them $1 a crank, which over the course of all those V8 engines, that adds up. Well, our technical glitch. All right, trust me.
Mr. Casey, look at your computer screen there. Hit escape. Now try it. No?
Click on that.
Click on it again.
Click on the picture.
Picture again.
Run your arrow over to it.
Oh. Here's a picture from the World's Fair in Chicago World's
There you
Fair.
go.
There it is. Thank you. Showing the whole method of casting that crank. And during World War II, McCarroll helped set up production of the Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines at the Rouge, and he was responsible for the lab tests on all the various military contracts. He was very highly regarded in his profession, and he even managed to avoid Sorensen's purge of those Model T guys. And even Harry Bennett wasn't able to undermine McCarroll. However, McCarroll fell victim to even darker forces. In 1948, he had a brain hemorrhage while he was on a fishing trip, no less, in northern Michigan, and he died. He was only 58. Okay. Ford Motor Company really documented all of its activities with both still photography and movies. They had a large number of people who did that. But Henry Ford's favorite photographer was George Evans. He was a self-taught photographer. He simply learned by doing, just like Henry Ford. And Henry Ford loved trial and error, and that was one of the things that attracted him to George Evelyn. Ford made Evelyn his personal photographer, with capturing images of Henry and Clara, the family, and there's Clara in her rose garden, the famous Vagabonds trips with Henry and Edison, etc. Drilling out the model of the V8 block. This was part of a series of murals that were at Ford pavilions in both the Chicago and the New York World's Fair. Wonderful, dramatic photographs. But as we've already discussed, working for Henry Ford was never easy, even if you were a photographer. Like a number of other people, Evelyn developed heart trouble. He had his first heart attack in 1944. And he retired the next year. He was only 59 when he retired. But removing the stress seems to have been good for him because he lived happily and peacefully for another 11 years. And last up is William Cameron. Today, politicians and business leaders are surrounded by spokespersons who write the press releases and they answer reporters' queries, and when their boss sticks his foot in his mouth, they say, now what Senator Muckety-Muck meant to say was, well, for 27 years, the guy who did that for Henry Ford was William Cameron. He first made his mark as a reporter and a columnist for the Detroit News, and when his editor at the News, a guy named E.G. Pip, left the News in 1918 to become editor of Ford's new weekly newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, Pip took Cameron along with him. And Cameron attracted Ford's attention during his libel lawsuit with the Chicago Tribune. Ford sued the Tribune for what he thought was, he said was libel. Cameron wrote the press releases that gave Ford's side the story. And in 1920, when Pip left the Independent, Cameron became editor of the Dearborn Independent. And his main job, and it was always his main job, was to translate Henry Ford's viewpoint and opinions into written terms, especially in a column that was known as Mr. Ford's Own Page. Basically, Cameron would go into Ford's office once a week, sit down, and they would just shoot the bull and get Henry's ideas on whatever was in his head at the moment. And then Cameron would take these remarks and recast them into something clear and succinct. However, the most notorious aspect of Cameron's tenure was Dearborn Independent's anti-Semitic campaign. that began in 1920. That's the first issue of that, the famous International Jew series, or infamous. Cameron was given the job of writing these articles, and despite the fact that he professed a distaste for the job, he was a good soldier, so he undertook the job. But there was something else going on here. It turns out that Cameron was a member of a group called the British Israelites. This is a group that believed that Anglo-Saxons and their descendants, modern descendants of Anglo-Saxons, were in fact descended from the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And therefore, Britain and the United States were really the promised land. And that what they called modern Hebrews, that is, Jews, were usurpers and imposters. So, with that, and this all preceded the whole writing of this International Jew series. So it was apparently easier for Cameron to get into doing this. And he kept it up. They eventually stopped this series, but they wrote another series about a Jewish lawyer named Aaron Shapiro, and he sued Ford for libel in 1927. Henry Ford never took the witness stand in that suit, but Cameron did. And Cameron took the responsibility for not only the articles against Aaron Shapiro, he took the responsibility for all of those articles as well, said Henry Ford didn't have anything to do with it. I did it all. Talk about a good soldier. And Henry Ford appreciated loyalty, and that kind of loyalty he rewarded. Dearborn Independent closed in 1927. Cameron stayed on as the chief spokesman, and a few years later, one of his responsibilities was drafting and delivering a spoken word equivalent of the Mr. Ford's own page pieces on a Ford-sponsored radio program called the Ford Sunday Evening Hour. And, well, I won't bother. There is a photograph that our technical glitch messed up. It shows Cameron standing at the microphone at the Ford Sunday Evening Hour. He labored mightily over his weekly speeches. He said it was like having a baby every week, and which meant over the life of this show, he gave birth to 285 such babies. Henry Ford was so loyal to Cameron after Cameron's loyalty that he gave Cameron a whole lot more leeway than he gave almost anybody else. Cameron was a heavy drinker. In fact, today we call him a functioning alcoholic. Henry Ford hated alcohol. Cameron would sometimes deliver these Ford Sunday Evening Hours talks while he was drunk, and seemed to do as well drunk or sober. Henry would have fired anybody else who pulled that. But with Cameron, Ford said, well, Cameron drunk's a better writer than anyone else I know. Henry Ford wanted people to be punctual. You got a meeting with me, you show up on time. Cameron, like a lot of alcoholics, didn't always show up on time. Ford said, well, he's all here when he gets here. He let him get away with this stuff. Cameron was even immune to Harry Bennett. Bennett tried to get Ford to fire Cameron. Ford wouldn't do it. When Cameron finally retired in 1946, Bennett had already been gone for 2 years. So Cameron was amazing. And despite his alcoholism, Cameron lived on until he was 76, died in 1955. So, there's your story. People whose service totaled 300 years with Henry Ford, they came from different backgrounds, different talents, they played different roles, They were all part of this enormous organization. They often suffered the consequences of working in very high-pressure jobs or the consequences of being in very toxic corporate politics. But they all contributed to that legacy of Henry Ford that continues today. Thank you.
Thank you, very good.
And I guess we got a bit of time, maybe a bit of time for some questions. If anybody has any questions. Answer them all.
The big question now, I had it yesterday at the museum, and there was a message on the message board last night. Did Henry Ford ever have a driver, dedicated driver?
He did. Actually, I think he had several, but yeah, he did. He was chauffeured around, and especially in his later years. But I think the family and the company probably preferred him to have a driver because he was a fast driver.
I'm sure he drove Fords.
He did. At Fairlane, which is not open to the public yet, but it will be. Again, they have both a Model T and a Model A coupe that I don't think he used a driver with those. There's also what was actually his last automobile, which was a 42 Ford sedan, I think. And literally on the last day of his life, his driver drove him around Fairlane because the Rouge, as somebody may know, the Rouge had flooded that night and the water was all over everywhere and it knocked out the powerhouse. So Henry took a tour in the car with his driver that day, and then of course that evening he died. So he did have a driver sometimes, and other times he drove himself.